Mr. Khan. Welcome, Mr. Khan. Let me just put Mr. Khan
Hey,
as present.
I was out a bit.
You missed half the class, Mr. Khan.
Yeah, I was out a bit yesterday. Had a kind of situation to deal with.
Yeah, I understand you had that situation, no worries. And Mr. Modest didn't make it. So, all right. So we'll hold that as our attendance for the day. All right. So we're into the second part, where we're looking at the theories that were generated over time to be able to treat with um, understanding and explaining leadership. So we have these theories that we want to look at, ending with the chaos theory. And the last theory we're going to look at is something called um, authentic leadership. So let's look at the first one. The first one here is the great man theory. So this great man theory is very um, old. It came up in the 19th century. Um, and it was hinged a lot on the Darwin approach to understanding society around us. And for those of you who remember Darwin, Darwin's approach to evolutionary theory, which was popular at the time that this came up, was um, that of survival of the fittest. So the approach here that they talked about is great men arose in society over time in the past, based upon based upon being able to accumulate power and influence, and that those particular individuals, because of some genetic makeup, were the ones who would maintain power, and that power was passed on to their sons and daughters, and they believed that in order to maintain that aristocratic nature, that they had to interbreed, and that would ensure that that lineage would stay put. So this is where leadership passed down from father to son primarily. The theory, however, ignored the emergence of women as great leaders simply because it fell outside the program, and they looked upon women who rose to positions of power in the past as just being aberrations of the thing, and just simply would ignore it when they were dealing with the whole thing. That soon gave over to another theory called the traits approach, in which in the early 1900s, the theory then said that there were particular traits that individuals had that gave them a position of power. And these people were seen as being powerful based upon those characteristics. And that included traits such as intelligence, your height, level of self-confidence, and that stuff differentiated them from non-leaders and therefore made them successful. Now, some of the other things that they didn't talk about in the text here was that they had to be white, that have blue eyes, blonde hair, and or they had to be from a Caucasian background, and they had to come from a particular line of individuals. So this actually was a list of things that they developed as being the traits. Now, the problem, however, was that the theory failed to produce a list of these traits that were correlated with people who became leaders, and therefore that theory didn't hold for very long because those particular traits, there was no commonality between the leaders that existed and the traits that they were talking about. Because if you had to be of a particular height, then how would you um, explain people like Hitler and Napoleon, who were shorter people who rose to be powerful individuals in society and that type of stuff. So this theory didn't hold for very long. Now, once those theories started to fail in terms of trying to explain why people were good leaders, David, you have a question? I see your mic is open.
I just went blank. I wasn't hearing anything.
Okay. Are you seeing things?
Yeah, no, it now come back up.
All right. Okay. So I guess that's some sort of Wi-Fi issue that you had there. All right. So after the great man and the trace theory kind of failed to say much about it, that led to the development of the behavioral approaches of trying to look at what people were doing to make them better leaders or good leaders. So basically, what they tried to do in these theories was to try and look at specific activities that these people used to be able to that categorize them as good leaders. So what they did is they went into the areas of great leadership or places where leadership was seen, and you'd see that this is primarily in the 50s and the 60s. So we're talking about after World War II. So the areas of biggest movement was in industry, because back in that time frame, the world was kind of rebuilding itself after the destruction of World War One and World War Two collectively, and they were rebuilding the world, and industry kind of drove things. So this is where the United States becomes important, because remember, of all the countries that were engaged in the war, the United States never really had too much destruction take place on its shores. It did have the attack at Pearl Harbor, but that was a military base. Um, but the 1950s to 60s saw the emergence of this behavioral technique. So what you have is people going into these large organizations, industrial-based organizations, and observing what were leaders doing. And they started to develop different types of behaviors that they started to ascribe towards characteristics of I shouldn't say characters, but behaviors that good managers and good leaders exhibited. So one theory here comes up with two behaviors: consideration and initiating structure. In essence, consideration was those actions that the scientists were able to look at that showed some level of concern and relationship building between the leader and the followers or subordinates. And the initiating structure would be any sort of operational activities or actions that the manager took. So that what they were looking at was, to what degree did they utilize those actions. So as I say, consideration is the degree of supporting activity that was shown towards subordinates, and initiating the degree to which the leader defines structures and structures his own role and the roles of subordinates towards the attainment of the formal group's goals, which really is organizational objectives. So they were looked at a two-dimensional approach here now. So what did you do that benefited the firm, as opposed to what did you do that benefited the relationship you developed with your subordinates? And they started to look at how many times they did this. So there's like a checkbox they would have. Every time you did something that they classified as consideration, they would put a checkbox, and then they'll anything that you did that was structural in nature, initiating structure, you put checkboxes, and you started to look at that kind of score there. And they tried to make those observations to eventually draw a conclusion as to, well, those who participated more in this activity would do this and so on. But of course, we'd see that necessarily didn't work that way. Another approach here from Blake and Morton, they propose another by what they call a bivariable study, where they looked at behaviors that showed concern for people as opposed to behaviors that were concerned with output and production. So again, these tried to look at what were managers doing or spending time doing, and how often they would act on one or the other type of behavior. And those things started to draw some sort of conclusions from what they were observing, and that led to them making some postulations as to what makes for a better leader. All right, Michigan studies, they actually came up, instead of two or bivariate, they came up with a multiple variables: task-oriented behaviors, relationship-oriented behaviors, and participative behaviors. That would be behaviors that allowed for the participation of people in decision-making processes. That's why it's referred to as participative leadership activities. So again, they started to try and broaden the activities and give a slightly different dimensions to it. And again, they basically were going into the industries and the firms and just making observations and trying to categorize the behaviors that they saw, and categorizing them or classifying them under one of these three types of behaviors, looking at the intensity of it, the length of time they spent doing those particular activities, and the possibly the kind of looking at the end results of the organization to see which organizations were better or worse off, which meant would the managers be deemed to be effective or ineffective based upon that. So at the end of the day, the criticisms that came up of these approaches was that, one, they were too simplistic in nature. They tried to bring good leadership down to just a few factors that contributed towards the effectiveness of a leader. And these particular behaviors ignored the circumstances or the situation that they were actually being conducted in. So they did not look at what environmental impact would have had on the behaviors. And as a result, basically what they found is that the results that they came from was inconclusive and inconsistent, because as they move from one firm to another, they would see different things, and at the end of the day, the theories didn't really bear fruit. That then led to a different theory now, or different approach, which they call situational contingency approaches. And this approach now, they started to broaden the perspective into looking at the behaviors based upon the situation that they found themselves. So again, now they're trying to broaden the observations that they're making and taking note of the circumstances in which the operations or the activities were being observed, which gives rise to this situational contingency approach. Again, the focus of their attention would be in industrial type activities, firms that was engaging in mass production, and they were practicing division of labor and that type of activity that they were talking about from the industrialized industries. So they came up with a couple of approaches that they looked at, because they were saying that contingency theory it didn't ignore the circumstances. In fact, it emphasized that leadership behavior could not be explained in a vacuum. It meant that you had to include the environmental influences that affected the outcomes or the behaviors of people. So they came up with this theory, the least preferred worker theory approach, was developed by Fiedler in the mid-60s, and it describes how the situation moderates the relationship between leaders, traits, and their effectiveness. So that's situational. Then you have a second theory, which was called the path goal theory, was written in 1957 by Giorgio Poulos, and he looked at it from the ability of the manager to make a link between the personal objectives of the individual and their path to get to that, and correlating that with the organizational objectives that had to be achieved by the company or the organization. So at the end of the day, what they were saying was that if the leader was able to show workers that in order for them to attain their personal goals, they would be more successful at doing so if they were likely to do the same operational goals or operational activities to get to those goals, then that would lead to a better relationship between the manager and the workers, and the performance of the organization would also be profitable. So that was something that they were trying to do. But again, these theories lacked supporting research because they only did it in a few cases, and they were very unclear as to the relationship between the environment and the activities of the business people. So again, the contingency theory kind of sort of fell apart a bit and suffered from the same inconclusive nature. That then led to something called influence theories. Now, influence theories has to do with that thing we talked about before, charisma. Initial studies started in Germany with Max Weber in 1924 to roughly about 1947. Now, if you pay attention to the dates, you're looking at the reign of Adolf Hitler, as he was seen to be a very, at that time, he was seen to be a very charismatic leader, and what he was able to do really spoke a lot about, or spoke to these people, that basically the nature of the leader and his ability to influence others was what was primarily based upon the success or failure of a leader, how much influence that they have. But we already spoke about the dangers inherent with charismatic leadership, which started to cause a lot of studies, because in 1977, Robert House went back into that theory and started to kind of formalize some of it and tried to test it, because, of course, coming out of what took place in the 1970s and subsequent behaviors by other charismatic people in political fields in particular, started to show some interesting returns. So they started to postulate that the problem with charismatic leadership has to do with the circumstances in which they found themselves. So again, they're bringing environment here. So charisma was based not on the individual themselves, but on how people responded to that. And in a lot of instances, what they found was that people's charisma was minimal in terms of its influence to the context in which that leadership was taking place, because the theory started to indicate that charismatic leadership really became important during periods when there was crisis occurring in society and people were willing to stand up for change. So they'd say things like Martin Luther King, JFK, all those people were compared to be, as well as Hitler, were all looked upon as being charismatic, but they were leading situations in which there was a crisis situation facing the country, and people were willing to make changes, and basically these people became the leaders who embodied that particular challenge to the status quo. So the downside of the charismatic thing is because of the amount of because somebody was seen as charismatic and leading important change in society, people had a habit of leaving charismatic leaders up to their own devices, and that creates a dangerous situation in which many of these leaders misuse their power, and more importantly, they can actually guide people towards a vision or a dream that is inherently dangerous. As you could see in the 1970s and 80s and beyond, you had a lot of so-called charismatic leaders who eventually led into the Jim Jones type activities that took place in the United States and in other parts of the world as well. You had in Korea and other places, you had the emergence of these charismatic leaders who pushed towards particularly dangerous types of activities, simply because these leaders were given deference. People weren't standing up to them. Yes, Jack?
So you think that the ignorance of our society attributes to
No.
charismatic leaders?
Well, the ignorance of the mass, the mob, yes, maybe. But interestingly enough, in a lot of instances, charismatic leaders are actually able to attract very intelligent people. And that makes a lot of people feel comfortable with the decisions that I'm making. Because if you can see a leader attracting very intelligent people into your activities and becoming part and parcel of the organization, then if you view yourself as being more simplistic and less educated, then how can you say, well, if he's doing it, why can't I get involved? I don't see a problem with this if they're doing it. And that's actually something that took place. But again, the reason for that is because charisma is about a reaction that people have to individuals that is emotional. And that's the danger of charismatic leadership. Charismatic leadership it brings into people a sense, a feeling that cannot be quantified, and that creates a bit of an issue across the board. So, but what happens is that the mob in itself um, responds in that emotional manner. But I would want to say that the level of education in society at that point in time and enlightenment in society would influence that, because of course there would be people who would be looking at these behaviors of these leaders and questioning a lot of what they were doing, which is where we go into the next policy or the next models that eventually emerged coming out of this kind of thinking. Right, Jack? See your hand still up. You wanted to add something else?
No, sir. No, sir. Thanks very much.
Okay, cool. All right. So that then led to, because of the dangers that they saw with charismatic leadership, it started to bring up the reciprocal leadership theories. So all these reciprocal leadership theories will focus on the relationship between leaders and followers, because again, as charisma indicates, the nature of that relationship is critical. And they had to reclassify the type of relationship. It wasn't just you lead and I follow without question. It wasn't that sheep following the shepherd kind of thing, which, if you think about it, I mean, religion is based upon that kind of concept. You know, you have a leader and you follow what the leader says, and you defer to what the leader says because the leader is divinely and that's the danger with religion. Huh? The leader is given divine intervention, so what they're saying has to be the truth because it comes from God. And again, this is all about belief structures and how people emotionally respond to these things. And when you take out logic and rationality from that type of relationship, you see it a lot in religious activities or religious organizations. You kind of have a bit of a problem there, which has led to, in a great number of instances, um, so-called religious leaders rising during the period in the 70s, as talks about here, and leading people into very dangerous types of activities. Hence the Jim Jones type of people, the Moonies, the you have a whole set of post apocalyptic kind of thing. They call them doomsday organizations. You're familiar with that concept? No? Fortunately, we don't seem to have a proliferation of that type of activities here, but we do have certain sects of religious activities that speak to some really very curious types of goals and objectives that are questionable from a logical point of view or rational point of view. All right, but the relational leadership theories that they've developed coming out of this will focus attention on the relationship between the leaders and followers and how one motivates the other and how the other holds the leader in check. And that's an important element that we want to pay attention to. So obviously, because leadership is not only about the leader itself, but rather what the leader is able to accomplish with the participation of the followers. Because if you think about it, this kind of like makes sense. Even if you come up with a really good idea and you have these fantastic leadership qualities, if nobody's willing to follow you, you're not going to be able to do anything. And that's the nature of what this leadership is talks about. So the theories that came up in relation to this is the transforming leadership theory, the servant leadership theory, and the followership theory. And they all tend to speak to the same thing. The transformational leadership theory and the servant leadership theory will be dealt with in a lot more detail in one of the presentations that one class group is going to be doing. Followership, we've spoken about before followership. So we're just going to overview a little bit of what they talk about here because it should come up in a lot of other areas. So the transforming leadership theory was emerged from this McGregor Burns, in 1978. And he defined transforming leadership as a process where leaders and followers raise one another to high levels of morality and motivation. And that's important because this is where the theories begin to look not only at how people behave, but the ethical values that are shared between the leader and the followership. And in this case here, they are looking at how that relationship is complementary, that one holds the other in check, basically. So the leaders will try to make sure that what they're doing appeals to people's higher values, higher ideals, moral values such as liberty, justice, and equality, peace, and humanitarianism, and not focus their attention on fear, greed, jealousy, and hatred. Now, it's interesting in the Trump environment when they were looking at and even in our one of our previous election periods, and it happens time and time again, you find politicians utilizing um, fear and hatred as methods of accumulating influence over others and by pulling support for them. And that was something that I saw very blatant in the Trump administration or the Trump campaign, where he, harped on the fact that the leaders that they had, being Obama, who was on the way out, um, allowed for for particular groups in the American society to rise in in status in their society to the detriment of other members of that society, and that then spoke to the fear and the jealousy that was created by the movement of one group of individuals in society, or perceived rise of one group in society over another, and that led to this overwhelming movement to bring somebody who would even the playing field and drain the swamp and all kind of rubbish that came up as a result of that. But we've seen this kind of nonsense work, I just say nonsense, this strategy work even in our elections here, where each party tries to paint the other organization as the worst thing since the devil came out, understand? And basically utilizing that fear to encourage people vote against them by voting for me. So at the end of the day, they're not appealing to higher ideals and moral values, but they are dealing to what people are most fearful about. And a lot of people cowed into that type of behavior will react as accordingly and vote to represent that particular situation. And that is something that we have to pay attention to. So the transforming leadership really is about bringing leaders and followers into a more positive, interactive relationship, because followers have to hold leaders in check, and leaders will direct us in terms of where they see our future lies. But our followers, or the responsibility of followers, is to keep everybody in check, to make sure followers should be able to, and we spoke about this from the other model that we talked about, should be able to prevent a leader from behaving in manners that are seen to be contrary to the ethical values of the organization that you're taking part in, so that we are all approaching a particular common purpose, but the way in which we're approaching it has to be ethical in nature. All right, and that's the crux of this particular transformational leadership theory. All right, and the focal point here now is the moral component of the theories that started to come up here. So it means that the theory becomes a little more broadened in terms of looking at the motivation behind leaders and people's behaviors. Why do we want to do the things we do? And as economists, we have a particular belief structure that we look at. So all of these individuals are this model is speaking to people who are looking to transform society. So if we look at these people here, each one of these people here represent somebody in leadership in the past that has led some sort of transformational movement. The JFK led the transformational thing. If you remember the statement he made, ask not what the country can do for you, but what you can do for the country. That transformation um, into giving back to society, and he also led the transformation into the space race. And of course, he dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the war that they had against the Soviet Union, those types of things. So he was seen as a transformational person because he sort of transformed the context of um, politics in the United States at that point in time. Mahatma Gandhi, of course, he was there for the transformation of India from a colonial, a colony into an independent state. And he was also responsible or part of the movement that led to the separation of India and Pakistan and all of the things that went with that. But again, it's about transforming the society through, and in his case here, through peaceful resistance, non-violent resistance. Those are the things. Both him and Martin Luther King utilized that approach in terms of change through non-violence. Lincoln here transformed the society, the American society, um, from slavery into freedom, and that was an important transformation that took place there. He was even assassinated because a lot of people didn't agree with that transformation because they saw what he was doing as threatening their economic livelihood. Um, uh, this gentleman here, this is Roosevelt. He actually was important during World War II because he led the transformation, the end of Nazism and socialism type of thing. But more importantly, he was responsible for transitioning the United States out of the Great Depression and into one of period of great prosperity in the United States. So he was seen as a transformational leader as he moved the country forward through economic strife. And of course, we have Mother Teresa here, who is transformational because she approached poverty in India and looked at um, encouraging people to want to transform the lives of people who are less fortunate in the world. So their lives were spent in transforming people across the world, especially in terms of the children and women in India and the levels of poverty that they were dealing with. So she gave her life up for that gave her life over to that purpose and that function. All right, so um, transformational leadership will always be contrasted to transactional leadership, but there are correlations between the two because transformation requires motivation and transaction can be one of the things. A transaction can be utilized as a motivational technique to get transformation to take place, so that if you want to transform an organization or transform a country, then one of the ways to do that is to use little transactions where if you do X, you get Y in terms of a reward. So motivational theory here comes in across the two spectrums there. So the combination of the two can be utilized by the same leader. So it's just different techniques of leadership that can be utilized to achieve the goals that you're looking at. So again, remember, transactional leadership is about transacting, getting something done by making some promise of value exchange. So we see that happening in jobs and places. I mean, people will take up more responsibility if they're given some reward for that. And the reward need not necessarily be only financial or materialistic. It could also be rewards that are more intrinsic in nature and more status building in terms of that. So it doesn't always have to be monetary in nature um, for that to happen. All right, so um, critics of the theory will focus on the overall lack of clarity and specificity, and that's because a lot of the things that the theory tried to write towards or to document were not easily captured in terms of evidence because the concepts were very abstract and the whole ideology behind it is very idealistic in nature, and that's something that we're going to be looking at in other theories. So this is one of the main criticisms that come up with that leadership theory. Servant leadership theory positions leaders differently. This is the second one that comes up in this batch of relational theories. This one looks at the relationship of the leader as being subservient to the followership. So it is the servant, the leader who serves the needs of the broader organization, primarily to do two things. One, to ensure that they are getting everything they need to be able to achieve the goals of the organization, and two, to be able to empower those individuals who are followers to themselves become leaders in the future. So sort of like succession planning built into the methodology that they developed here. All right. This kind of servant leadership is something that one of our political parties here at the UNC tried it under the Ms. Besesser's leadership. But I had the feeling that a lot of the members of the party did not agree with it because they have a particular view of how government works. But I definitely remember one of the mantras that she utilized coming into power during that period was service, 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 if those of you all can recall it. It was a really good place to be and a really good ideology to work with, but I don't think there was follow through with it in terms of across the board. People weren't, a lot of leaders don't see themselves as servants to others, and servant leadership is a theory that, as I said before, one of the groups is going to be dealing with this in more detail as to the nature of servant leadership and how it works. So we could wait for that when it comes up in the later chapters. All right. So the concept is that the leaders are really just trustees of the organization. And if you think about it, people who lead today are really just holding place for the leaders that come in the future. But what we need to do while we are in the position of being in charge and responsible, we need to empower those who are to come behind us to be able to move the organization forward or move the country forward into a better place than we left it. So, I mean, if you think about it from that perspective, parents do the same thing. Each parent is trying to build a life for their children that is better than what they themselves experience. So as parents, you might be able to identify with that particular comparison to see the nature of how this leadership model works. That makes sense, guys? All right. So the whole thing about it is always the leader is serving the others in the organization, and therefore everything is kind of focused upon the values of lifting that everybody up in a kind of holistic manner, trying to bring everybody into the fold kind of thing. Again, it sounds kind of hairy-fairy and kind of cultish in its behavior, but I mean there's even part of the scripture that speaks to this where for those of you who are of the Christian thing, it speaks to the time when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples, where he was, through example, trying to lead the way of being a servant leader, that type of behavior. So something for you all to think about in terms of the correlation between studies in the Bible or the use of the Bible in terms of leadership and servant leadership processes. All right. So the whole problem here with servant leadership that I see is that a lot of people view leadership as something that puts them in a higher status. But servant leadership is knocking that status down and saying to you as the leader that you're not really your goal is not to achieve all these great things or becomes a status symbol. Your goal is to empower everybody else to become more knowledgeable, to gain more independence and interdependence, to be becoming their leaders themselves. So a lot of people see that as being threatening, and just letting you know. So followership speaks to this particular thing that we met before, where the objective of the followership theory was to redefine the relationship between leaders and followers and give followers more power to be able to influence leaders and ensure that leaders don't fall behind. So the objective is to create effective followers, avoid the alienated, the sheep, the yes people. But you remember I was talking about this, alienated followers, they're the worst element in any organization. If you have alienated people in your organization, then you can't accomplish anything because they're not going to do anything, they're not going to say anything. Sheep and yes people are dangerous because they will do whatever you say without critical thinking. And survivors are the ones who will tend to emerge from each of these and eventually kind of come across to being effective followers. So what is particularly important for the effective followers is that they manage themselves well, they're committed to the organization and to its principles and ethical values. They build their competencies. So again, the leader is responsible for helping them to build their competencies to be able to get the most out of them. They're courageous, honest, and credible. And that's important because they have to stand up to the negative possibilities that can come from the leader. They have to show that leader that if they're doing the wrong things, hey, stop what you're doing or move yourself out from a position of leadership, because you are in essence creating followers who become capable and sometimes even more capable than yourself to do the job that you're looking at there. So it's, as they refer to it, a reciprocal relationship where leaders and followers don't see themselves as followers, but they see themselves as co-adventurers. So again, it's about bringing up the status of these individuals more on par with the leader, so that the leader is not somebody who's looked upon as a demigod type of situation, but as that somebody who is a person of the earth and, more importantly, fallible enough to know that if they do the wrong thing, other people will be able to bring them up on those particular behaviors. So those are the key relational theory, the relational models that came up, the three of them. Now, what changes though is coming out of the 1990s, the latter 1990s into the 2000s, the millennium, was the switch over from the industrial paradigm. We spoke about this before. The vast majority of theories that came up before really spoke to the industrial circumstances under which the theories were driven and written about. The industrial paradigm really speaks to an organization that is set up to produce output and create products that meet the requirements of the society. But the industrial paradigm is one that we moved away from, because the mainstay of industrial activity has sort of left and moved into a more peripheral type of activity. And where we are now is more in terms of tertiary services, more than manufacturing and that type of stuff. So the 20th century, really, the theories were as they describe it there. In the 20th century, the industrial era, the theories were structurally and functionalist, management oriented, personalistic and focusing only on what the leader needs, goal achievement dominated, self-interested and individualistic in outlook, male-oriented, utilitarian and materialistic in its ethical perspective, and rationally, technocratically, rationalistic, technocratic, linear, quantitative, and scientific in its language and methodology. So if any of you all ever go back and read some of those industrial leadership theories, you'll be shocked at the amount of math that is utilized, and especially quantitative mathematics and statistical analysis that is utilized to try to indicate to people, well, this is the way you need to be doing things, because these are management rights. You have to identify all the management objectives, and when the manager, so the manager is always seen as male, never for a female, that type of stuff. So there was very little emotive or emotional content that was brought to bear on a lot of these earlier theories because they were couched in an environment that was seen to be um, devoid of emotion and soft goals, that type of stuff. Very, very thing. But the nature of the world has changed. The relational theories that came up afterwards signal a paradigm shift out of that industrial to post-industrial. And if we think about the emergence of those theories, you could think about what was taking place in the 70s and 60s and 70s in the world. You had that flower power movement. You had the influence of Eastern culture coming down through music and through a lot of the artists who were bringing those particular cultures and saying, hey, there's a better way to do things. We are all together. We're one love. Um, we have to look after the earth. It's the only earth we have. And we need to be paying attention to the environment and all this sort of one love approach to things started to influence, and that's where a lot of the reciprocal theories come from. Because if you think about the context of the 70s, and well, the 80s was the period of excess because of the amount of economic growth that was taking place. But the thinking of the times influenced the type of theoretical underpinnings that were taking place in the development of the leadership programs. But we have another change that's taking place where we're going through periods of unprecedented economic, technological, socio-political, and ethical turmoil. So we can see that on a regular basis. Since 2000s, we've gone from the housing crisis, we've gone through the banking crisis, we've gone through a recession, we've gone through, right now we have the war going on in Ukraine, which is having a massive amount of economic impact on us. So that basically what the theories that were developed in those periods do not reflect the world we live in today. And that is where the challenge sits with us, because when we were prepared in school, we were prepared to view the world in this neat, controllable environment. The reality is that our world is no longer seen as being a neat and controllable world. A lot of our world is disorderly, and in fact, that brings us into the chaos theory. The world is not it's not possible for us to control all the elements of the world. The world is filled with chaos, but in that chaos, there is you either get run over by the chaos or you have to embrace the chaos and work with it rather than fear it. That's the main thing. So these new methodologies that are looking to treat with it have to be more flexible. The theories have to be able to adjust quickly with the changing environments that come up and the changing circumstances that we find ourselves being faced with. So we have another, people are very afraid right now. I don't know if any of you all are following this, but there's been a Silicon Valley bank failure in the States, and it's a very large bank, and the fallout of that failure is feared that it may start to impact upon the general banking structure that exists. And if it starts to affect the American banking structure, it's going to start affecting the rest of the world. And of course, as they say in the past, or as we say, if the United States catches a cold, the rest of the world gets pneumonia. Have you all ever heard that analogy being made? No? All
Yes,
right.
sir.
Yeah. Okay, so chaos has been defined as order without predictability. But one of the other things that another author has spoken about, that one of the important things we have to recognize that in chaos there's a hidden pattern of behavior that we do not clearly see, and therefore it is important for us to pay attention to what is happening in the chaos, because we have to be able to operate and work in that chaotic environment. Like, so consider the pandemic situation that we just kind of now, well, coming out from, but dealing with the fallout from the pandemic behaviors. That is part of the chaos system. But and the thing about it is that in it there is a pattern that existed, but hindsight gives us the ability to look at the pattern. But while we're going through the changes and the chaos, we had to work within what we could have seen from the circumstances that were living with us. So chaos theory starts to speak to developing systems that can help us to navigate that chaotic world. I think they refer to it as the quantum world. And one of the things that we had to look at focusing our attention on was, one, what was the origin of the chaos or the change that we're looking at? Two, what are the relationships and connections that we're making that helped us to navigate through? And three, recognizing that no correct answer, no one correct solution exists, but a combination of solutions can be utilized to be able to find an overall solution. So it's not about any one individual or one thing being able to correct what's going on, but a combination of different things that work together to be able to do it. And we have to pay attention to where it started. Why do we need to pay attention? Because very often we can predict the outcome if we pay attention to where things began. That's what the theory is telling us. Because the pattern begins to show itself as we begin to observe. The problem is while we are going through that chaotic period, we have a tendency to get caught up in the chaos and not spend a little bit of time looking back and reflecting on where we came from and what we ended up doing to get through it. So you'd recognize, for example, the solutions that we've ended up with, for instance, in terms of the online classes that COSTAT has gone through. The transition that we've gone from face-to-face classes being our mainstay of activity to now online classes becoming the modus operandi. That is a transition that we were trying to make very slowly over a period of time, but because of the pandemic, it forced us to pivot quickly into the online environment to be able to facilitate students' development and training. So much so now that we can't go backwards. Very few students want to go back into the classroom. How many classes y'all doing this semester or even last semester involve sitting in a class all day long?
None.
And at the end of the day, what I found, every time we've listed a class as being a face-to-face class, I recognize that students don't want to go there. And in fact, students who in the past,
Correct.
students who in the past always spoke about, nah, I don't like doing things online. I like to be right there when things are going on. Now you can't get them to even want to commit to a live class unless it's absolutely necessary. All right. I mean, it has to be something physical you have to go and do. It can't be you go and sit down in a class and listen to somebody lecture. You could do that at home. It's more convenient and less costly. All right. That makes sense. All right. So those are some of the transitions. So now that we've opened Pandora's box in terms of the online classes, we can't go back. We can't shut that box anymore. So we have to think about it from that perspective as well. So chaos systems or chaos theory leads us into this to this thinking here now. Now we have to pay attention to something here that they talk about is the realization that we cannot control the world. Let's start with that. And that we have to pay attention to sensitivity to the initial condition. This was what I was talking about. We have to be paying attention to what caused it. Because if we focus on what caused it, it will begin to indicate to us where it will end up or where we will end up going into. So it's something for us to pay attention to. Try and apply that technique to certain things. The next element is that we have to pay attention to the relationships that we've developed. that helped us to navigate through. And we have to recognize that we cannot do this independently. We have to do this with others and with other institutions. We can't just swing on our own and expect that we will survive. So the other concept that comes here is the andness concept. Anding is a situation where we think of a solution and it to something else. So literally, you're going to try this and that and something else. The anding becomes this concept where no one individual, no one solution is the best solution. And in fact, a number of slightly correct ones or partially correct solutions can give rise to a better approach to a problem than just trying to look at it from one perspective, which is why we always speak about working in groups, because groups can look at a problem from numerous perspectives, primarily especially if people come from different environments, they'll bring a different take on things. That makes sense, guys? So that whole and process and the idea of looking at both and, not either or. So something might be right or wrong, but it might also be right and wrong. So now if that makes sense to you. They want us to look at things as being both right and wrong, not right or wrong. So nothing is mutually exclusive. So the idea is to be able to bring to bear thinking that allows for combinations that may not have existed in our thinking processes before, to be able to tackle problems that we encounter, issues that we encounter. Leadership also will have to approach this. The leaders would need to be open to this kind of thinking process and be open to the anding, the paying attention to relationships, paying attention to initializing circumstances to be able to move an organization forward. Because if you think about global warming as a crisis situation that's facing the world, there's no one right or wrong response. Everybody has a perception of what they need to be doing. And it is going to be a combination of a lot of things that will help to correct the issues that we're probably facing and help to deal with the situation. And it's not only just the methodologies that we're going to be utilizing, we also have to bring a lot of people into play. Because we can't correct the problems or deal with the issues if we don't change everybody from an individualistic basis, especially when it comes to our nature of consumption and how we treat with our waste and how we treat with power usage and all those kind of things. Those are the kind of things that we have to tackle. Those are not easy problems. Those are phenomenally difficult problems that have to be dealt with, and simple responses and simple solutions do not exist. So don't be fooled by anybody who's coming to you with those kind of simple ideas, right? So better than having no solution is having partial solutions. That's another way to look at it. So you're trying to fix a problem, you don't get a single answer, but you get several different partial responses that eventually come up with something that could work. All right. It might sound like a little patchwork, but that's the nature of it. Now, okay, so that's chaos system, and I think I've described it in its essence throughout the whole thing here. I haven't seen anything of critical nature. Oh, this is an interesting one. The chaos world is self-organizing. So this is something that I felt was really interesting, because even though in the chaos, and I guess you could see that with when something goes wrong around you, there's its own system and of self-organization that takes place. So the way I could think about this is, have you ever destroyed an ant's nest and then see what happens after the fact? Besides probably getting yourself bitten to shreds by ants. If you damage something, which it means the ant colony is facing crisis situation in terms of destruction, they will then reorganize and self-organize themselves to get back into a situation. The nest will not look like the way it was before, but they will organize themselves in a way in which they would correct and thrive based upon the change that was made based on what took place with the environment. Similarly, human beings do the same thing too. We have already made adjustments based upon the pandemic situation that we faced, and we have adjusted our behaviors and actions to meet those predicaments that we faced. Now, the problem with this is that this theory is very vague. It does not have a lot of things that we could kind of put our teeth into. But if you think about it, a lot of our life is not describable. It's based on how we feel, how we respond, what we think, and in terms of getting evidence of it working is going to be hard. All right, but we have to understand too that as we interact with each other throughout all of the different things, the relationships that we develop become a very important part of who we are as an individual. This is something that I see oftentimes with I have to say with police officers more so when they operate in batches, because they always kind of remain committed to each other in the batches, and I find that indicative of that whole system of the depth of connectivity in terms of when they go through periods of intense change and stress, they've been able to develop a type of relationship that will survive a lot longer than some of the things that we've been paying attention to before. I don't know if that rings any bells, but I know your batches, the guys who have, and I think the fire services has a similar type of approach, and the regiment might have a same batch approach to things. You might be able to always connect with those individuals who you came up with through your basic training, because you have that particular type of connectivity with them during that period. I don't know if I hit it on something right, but it develops its own momentum, and you all kind of, it's sort of like, I know, for example, when I went to school, I'm still friends with a lot of people who I remain in contact with all the time because of the developmental stages that we went through with each other, and we were able to connect with each other, and we have a common language that we speak to each other that nobody else might be able to understand because you weren't there. You understand? All right. So the last theory that is probably one of the more later developments is called authentic leadership. Now, the one thing I have to say about this theory, it's very difficult to kind of wrap your head around because it posits an idealistic situation which does not necessarily look attainable in the short run, but it gives us an ideal against which we can begin to approach. So if we get there some way, we will be able to more than likely have a higher quality of leadership if we attempt to be authentic leaders. So the reason why I wanted to say it this way is because in this particular leadership model, it focuses on the leadership relationships and the nature of that relationship between follower and leader is going to be based upon authentic relationships. And authentic relationships are based upon people who are, this is what the authentic leader is supposed to be. All right? Describes authentic leadership as the confluence of positive psychology, transformational leadership, moral, ethical leadership, and the leader themselves is seen as somebody who is confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, transparent, moral or ethical or both, future-oriented, and gives priority to developing associates to be leaders. Now, that's a lot of descriptors for somebody to try to accomplish. And this is one of the reasons why I look at this leadership model here that they're talking about as one that is hopeful for the future, that gives us an image of what we can try to achieve. Whether or not it's actually achievable is is dependent upon our willingness to want to give in to this particular type of thinking and move towards it. All right. Persons who have achieved high levels of authenticity in that way are known, um, they know who they are, what they believe, and what they value, and they act upon those values and beliefs while transparently interacting with others. So these are descriptors that they've been utilizing about the leader themselves. Um, so the whole thing about it is that that level of authenticity is at the basis of the entire model. That everybody, and this also extends now to the followership. Followership will also need to be authentic as well, because the leader, through his own example, is going to indicate to others, well, we all need to be this way, and we all need to move in this particular manner to be able to achieve the things that we want to. Um, I see this type of leadership working in religious types of organization. It'd be wonderful to have this in a political organization that doesn't have any sort of subplot type of activities taking place, and other underhanded types of activities. But given the realities that we work in, and the fact that different people in societies have different objectives in life, it kind of speaks to a hope for the future kind of thing. And that is the biggest issue I would think with the nature of this particular model. It speaks to a nature. So here they talk about all of these other characteristics, emphasis on follow worthy objectives. It speaks to a kind of hairy-fairy approach to the world, but at the end of the day, it's idealistic in nature. It's almost like a fairy tale type of thing. Um, Again, um, if we could get people to be halfway towards this, we'll be probably better off than we are at this point in time, in, in terms of having more authentic leadership. And it's not absolutely impossible. I mean, I could see it happening in small organizations, in classrooms activities, that type of stuff. Um, but to get this on a broad scale would be a serious challenge, as far as I can see. But as I said before, it's an example of where we would ought to be able to move our um, leadership models into. And we're going to speak to that when we look next week at the relational leadership model. It's going to speak a lot to the quality of the leader and how authentic they're going to be in terms of their behavior. So their behavior is not just limited to what they do in the organization, but also speaks to how they behave in the wider environment that they looked at in action. All right, so I'll leave the authentic leadership for now as basically you all can go through this and have a look at it or read about authentic leadership if you're interested in getting a little more idea about it. Um, Moving on from there. So I just want to come up to the chapter conclusion here. So we've looked at the origin of the word leader. We've looked at where leadership comes from. We've looked at the context in which leadership has been developed, starting from the Darwinian period, moving all the way to our current chaos theory or chaos issues that are facing us at this point in time, or the, the paradigm that we're looking at here. We've also looked at the way in which leadership theory was developed over time. So we looked at trait theory, great man theory, relational leadership models. We looked at the contingency approach. So we looked at more or less the evolution of leadership in its theoretical development through time. And we're looking at the last model that we looked at there is what currently holds in terms of the ideology moving forward. And it kind of makes sense because we've gone through all these other stages of leadership. So the objective now is to move us towards that idealistic approach to looking at things, and hopefully we can develop a model that will be able to help us achieve those types of things. So that's what the theory is looking at in relation to us moving through. So you can see that general transition across the board. Now, one of the things I like this thing. Finally, we introduced the emergence of authentic leadership, which is with its focus on leadership as a core aspect of our very being, hope, trust, and positive emotions, concern for understanding the attitudes and behaviors of followers. Authentic leadership offers a new way for us to look at leadership moving forward. All right. So at the end of the day here now, we looked at a lot of stuff. Now, remember, you're not going to be tested on this, but what I really want you all to get out of this is an appreciation of how from the early 1300s to now, we've traveled a lot of space in terms of looking at the development of one particular concept through that time frame from 1300 onwards. I mean, that's what we looked at this evening. And that's a lot of information to try and work with. But what I can say to you, you don't need to stress about it. I just want you to be able to wrap your mind around it, think about it, understand that most things in life go through a developmental process. And we are only at this stage here now in 2023. Where we go from here is solely going to be dependent upon how we as a society begin to push forward for certain types of behaviors that we want to see in our leadership. Because as you saw before, the prevailing thinking develops or has an impact on the nature of how we theorize about a social phenomenon known as leadership. All right, guys. So that's it for the evening. Anybody has any questions or thoughts they want to leave us with? Wondering how many of you are sleeping. All right.
We here, so we here. We're good.
Yeah,
Yes.
we
Yes, sir.
we
Yeah.
Yeah, so we had to.
Yeah, I know it's a lot. It's a lot all at once. All right. So let me stop sharing. There are no questions, right? Anybody wants to ask anything or make a comment?
No question.
All right.
None
So
of this time, sir.
all right. Let me stop the recording.